Daily Words of God. After God did the work of the age of law, the Old Testament was produced, and it was then that people began to read the Bible. After Jesus came, he did the work of the age of grace, and his apostles wrote the New Testament. Thus were the Old and New Testaments of the Bible produced, and even unto today, all those who believe in God have been reading the Bible. The Bible is a book of history. Of course, it also contains some of the foretelling of prophets, and such foretelling is by no means history. The Bible includes several parts. There is not just prophecy, or only the work of Jehovah, nor are there only the Pauline epistles. You must know how many parts the Bible includes. The Old Testament contains Genesis, Exodus, and there are also the books of prophecy that the prophets wrote. At the end, the Old Testament finishes with the book of Malachi. It records the work of the age of law, which was led by Jehovah. From Genesis to the book of Malachi, it is a comprehensive record of all the work of the age of law. Which is to say, the Old Testament records all that was experienced by the people who were guided by Jehovah in the age of law. During the Old Testament age of law, the great number of prophets raised up by Jehovah spoke prophecy for him. They gave instructions to various tribes and nations, and foretold the work that Jehovah would do. These people who had been raised up had all been given the spirit of prophecy by Jehovah. They were able to see the visions from Jehovah and hear his voice, and thus they were inspired by him and wrote prophecy. The work they did was the expression of the voice of Jehovah, the expression of the prophecy of Jehovah, and Jehovah's work at the time was simply to guide people using the Spirit. He did not become flesh, and people saw nothing of his face. Thus, he raised up many prophets to do his work, and gave them oracles that they passed on to every tribe and clan of Israel. Their work was to speak prophecy, and some of them wrote down Jehovah's instructions to them to show to others. Jehovah raised these people up to speak prophecy, to foretell the work of the future or the work still to be done during that time, so that people could behold the wondrousness and wisdom of Jehovah. These books of prophecy were quite different from the other books of the Bible. They were words spoken or written by those who had been given the spirit of prophecy, by those who had gained the visions or voice from Jehovah. Apart from the books of prophecy, everything else in the Old Testament is made up of records made by people after Jehovah had finished his work. These books cannot stand in for the foretelling spoken by the prophets raised up by Jehovah, just as Genesis and Exodus cannot be compared to the book of Isaiah and the book of Daniel. The prophecies were spoken before the work had been carried out. The other books, meanwhile, were written after the work had been finished, which was what people were capable of. The prophets of that time were inspired by Jehovah and spoke some prophecy. They spoke many words, and they prophesied the things of the age of grace, as well as the destruction of the world in the last days, the work that Jehovah planned to do. The remaining books all record the work done by Jehovah in Israel. Thus, when you read the Bible, you are mainly reading about what Jehovah did in Israel. The Bible's Old Testament primarily records Jehovah's work of guiding Israel, his use of Moses to guide the Israelites out of Egypt, who rid them of the Pharaoh's shackles and took them out into the wilderness, after which they entered Canaan, and everything following this was their life in Canaan. All apart from this is made up of records of Jehovah's work throughout Israel. Everything recorded in the Old Testament is Jehovah's work in Israel. It is the work Jehovah did in the land in which he made Adam and Eve. From when God officially began to lead the people on earth after Noah, all that is recorded in the Old Testament is the work of Israel. And why is there not recorded any work beyond Israel? Because the land of Israel is the cradle of mankind. In the beginning, there were no other countries apart from Israel, and Jehovah did not work in any other place. In this way, what is recorded in the Old Testament of the Bible is purely God's work in Israel at that time. The words spoken by the prophets, by Isaiah, Daniel, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, their words foretell his other work on earth. They foretell the work of Jehovah God himself. All this came from God. It was the work of the Holy Spirit. And apart from these books of the prophets, everything else is a record of people's experiences of Jehovah's work at the time. The work of creation happened before there was mankind, but the book of Genesis only came after there was mankind. It was a book written by Moses during the age of law. It is like the things that happen among you today. After they happen, you write them down to show to people in the future. And for the people of the future, what you have recorded are things that happened in times past. They are nothing more than history. The things recorded in the Old Testament are Jehovah's work in Israel, and that which is recorded in the New Testament is the work of Jesus during the age of grace. They document the work done by God in two different ages. The Old Testament documents the work of God during the age of law, and thus the Old Testament is a historical book, while the New Testament is the product of the work of the age of grace. When the new work began, the New Testament also became out of date, and thus the New Testament is also a historical book. Of course, the New Testament is not as systematic as the Old Testament, nor does it record as many things. All of the many words spoken by Jehovah are recorded in the Old Testament of the Bible, whereas only some of the words of Jesus are recorded in the four Gospels. Of course, Jesus also did a lot of work, but it was not recorded in detail. There is less recorded in the New Testament because of how much work Jesus did. The amount of work he did during 3.5 years on earth and the work of the apostles was far less than the work of Jehovah. And thus, there are fewer books in the New Testament than the Old Testament.